Hello, everyone. Today we will look at the issue of slavery and why God allowed it. To understand the biblical laws of slavery, one must first understand what slavery was like in the ancient world. It was not a racial system like the transatlantic slave trade of the 16th and 19th centuries, where Africans were abducted, transported in terrible conditions across the ocean, and exploited on plantations as disenfranchised property solely because of their skin color. In the ancient world, slavery was an economic system that existed in all civilizations without exception. In Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome. People became slaves for several reasons. The first was prisoners of war. When one nation conquered another, the victors either killed the vanquished or enslaved them. The second is debt slavery. A person unable to pay off a debt sold himself or family members into slavery for a certain period of time in order to work off the debt. The third was birth. The children of slaves automatically became slaves. The fourth was self-sale. The poor, who had no means of subsistence, voluntarily sold themselves into slavery in order to get a roof over their heads and food. Fifth, crime. Some criminals were sentenced to slavery instead of prison or the death penalty. In the ancient world, without social security, pensions, insurance, or charitable organizations, slavery was often the only way for the poor, the sick, widows, and orphans to survive. It was an alternative to starvation. The slave had guaranteed housing, food, clothing, medical care, and protection from his master. For many, it was better than the life of a free beggar. When God gave the law to Moses on Mount Sinai, he did not abolish slavery instantly. It would have destroyed the economy and society, leaving millions of people without means of livelihood. Instead, he imposed drastic restrictions that made Israeli slavery fundamentally different from that of neighboring nations. Here are the key laws from the book of Exodus. First, if a Jew is sold into slavery, he serves only 6 years, and in the 7th year, he is released for free. This meant that debt slavery was temporary, a maximum of 6 years, after which the debt was considered repaid. Moreover, every 50th year was a jubilee year when all Jewish slaves were freed, even if 6 years of service had not passed. This prevented permanent slavery among God's people. Secondly, when a slave is released, the master is obliged to give him generously cattle, grain, and wine so that he can start an independent life and not end up in poverty again. God says, "Do not let him go empty-handed, but provide for him from your flocks, from your threshing floor, and from your winepress." Third, if a slave runs away from his abusive master to another Israeli, he must not be returned. Moreover, a runaway slave needs to be given shelter and protection. This is a unique law. In other ancient codes, the death penalty was imposed for harboring a runaway slave. Fourth, if the master knocks out a tooth or damages an eye, the slave immediately receives freedom as compensation. This is the law on bodily integrity. You cannot mutilate a slave with impunity. Fifth, if a master kills a slave with a blow, the master must be punished with death. Yes, there is a caveat. If a slave does not die immediately but after a day or two, the master is not punished, because it is assumed that he did not intend to kill, and the death occurred due to unforeseen complications. But the very fact that killing a slave was equivalent to killing a free man was revolutionary. In Roman law, for example, a master could kill a slave with impunity. Sixth, a slave has the right to rest on the Sabbath on an equal basis with free people. Every 7th week, the slave rests, does not work, and participates in worship. This is a recognition of his human dignity and spiritual nature. But the laws on foreign slaves were more severe. The book of Leviticus says, "And that your manservant and your maidservant may be with you, then buy for yourselves a manservant and a maidservant from the nations that are around you. You may also buy from the children of the settlers who have settled with you, and from their tribe that is with you, which was born to them in your land, and they may be yours. You can inherit them and pass them on to your sons by yourself, as an estate, forever own them as slaves. But do not rule over your brothers, the children of Israel, one over another with cruelty. There is a clear difference here. Jews cannot be kept in permanent slavery, but foreigners can. Why? Because Israel itself was a nation of slaves, freed by God from Egypt. God constantly reminded them, "Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God delivered you. Therefore I command you this today." The experience of slavery was supposed to teach the Israelites mercy and justice, but this rule did not apply to the surrounding peoples. They remained in slavery for life. This seems unfair to the modern reader, but you need to understand the context. At that time, every nation enslaved prisoners and debtors. Israel was no exception. God did not create a utopia. He regulated the existing system, making it less cruel, more humane, gradually guiding humanity towards the ideal. The principle of progressive revelation means that God revealed His will gradually, adapting His requirements to the moral and cultural maturity of people. Jesus explained this principle when the Pharisees asked Him about divorce. "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but at first it was not so." God allowed divorce not because it was an ideal, but because people were unable to live up to an ideal standard. It's the same with slavery. In the Old Testament, God tolerated slavery, but limited its cruelty and created conditions for its weakening. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul writes, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile anymore. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." This is a revolutionary statement. In the church, everyone is equal before God, regardless of social status. Paul sends the runaway slave Onesimus back to his master Philemon, but asks him to receive him no longer as a slave, but above a slave, a beloved brother. Christianity did not stage a slave uprising and did not call for a revolution. This would have led to mass killings and chaos. Instead, it changed people's hearts by teaching that a slave is a brother in Christ, an image of God worthy of love and respect. When these ideas became ingrained in culture, slavery became morally unacceptable, and it was Christians who led the abolitionist movement in the 18th and 19th centuries, fighting for the abolition of slavery. God could say through Moses, "From now on, slavery is forbidden in Israel." Why didn't He do it? The first reason is an economic catastrophe. Instant liberation of all slaves without compensation would ruin the owners and leave former slaves without means of livelihood, housing, or work. Mass poverty and famine would follow. The second reason is cultural immaturity. The people who had just emerged from slavery in Egypt were not yet ready for the radical equality of all people. The third reason is the pedagogical strategy. God taught Israel gradually, raising the moral bar step by step. God allowed slavery in the Old Testament not because He approved of it, but because humanity was not ready to live without it, and an instant abolition would cause more harm than good.